Hello and welcome to this video on the functionalist perspective of crime and deviance. The first sociological approach to crime and deviance we need to consider is that of functionalism, which grows out of the work of Emile Durkheim. Functionalists see society as a system with a shared value consensus. That is to say that broadly speaking, society is based on agreement. This is disrupted by crime and deviance when it occurs. However, functionalists would argue that deviance is inevitable and in some instances can be in fact good for society. So we need to consider, do certain conditions foster crime? And why do subcultures of delinquency exist? How and why do they come about? As a quick reminder, functionalism is the view that society is a system of interrelated and interdependent units, and this is held together by a shared value consensus. These units may include things such as the family, education, the government, the media, and so on. And what binds them together is an agreement about what is important in our society. Sharing culture creates what is known as social solidarity, that is to say individuals in society, because we share culture with each other, we feel a sense of connection and brotherhood with each other. And this shapes how we think and how we behave towards each other and towards society more generally. Society has two mechanisms by which to create this social solidarity. Firstly, socialization, which helps individuals internalize society's norms and values. So here we're thinking about primary socialization in the family and secondary socialization that takes place in places such as education. Secondly, social control, a mechanism which rewards compliance and conformity to the norms and rules within our society, but punishes deviance from them, upholding therefore expected behaviours. One would normally assume that functionalists would be wholly negative regarding crime and deviance, as it upsets the optimum functioning of our society. And whilst functionalists would argue that too much crime or too much deviance could destabilise our society and undermine it, they would identify this one key trend in all human societies that have ever existed. That is, crime and deviance has been present, and therefore crime and deviance is normal, natural, and in all societies. The question for us, therefore, is why is crime inevitable? Why is it normal, natural, and in all societies? Functionalists would say firstly that not everyone is socialized into the shared norms and values of our society to the same degree. This leads to difference between individuals and therefore deviation. We're not all being brought up the same way, we're not all being taught the same rules and norms to the same extent. And so as a result of that difference, we're going to see deviance. Secondly, in complex modern societies, such as our own here in the UK, diverse lifestyles can lead to the creation of subcultures, which in turn have their own values and norms, or indeed culture. This may contradict the mainstream culture of society and therefore would be seen as deviant. So deviance is almost built in to the nature of modern society. Durkheim argued that in modern societies there is a tendency towards what he referred to as anomie, also known as normlessness, or a lack or loss of norms, or that which is considered to be normal. Increasingly complex societies, such as our own, breed increasingly complex individuals. Hence, we start to see greater diversity, meaning greater differences between individuals. As a result, this weakens the rules and norms which govern our behaviour, leading to deviance, leading ultimately to a feeling of anomie or normlessness, a lack of surety about what is normal, acceptable, and considered correct in one society. Interestingly, functionalists such as Durkheim actually argue that there may in fact be some positive functions of crime. The first positive function is boundary maintenance. That when crime occurs and is identified, it helps in maintaining the boundary between the good, law-abiding us and the evil, law-breaking them. It creates a sense of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. This reinforces moral codes, it reinforces norms, and it reinforces values. So it helps us to realise where the boundaries are within society. The second positive function that functionalists such as Durkheim would identify is adaptation and change. All changes in society begin with an act of deviance. What does this mean? Well, at some point, it takes an individual to say, well, hold on a minute, we always do it this way. What if we did it that way? What if this new way might be better than the old way? But in doing that, they would be deviating from the norm. Without any deviance, there would be no change in society. And this could be a sign of a society that is too tightly controlled. Good examples could be votes for women. So at some point, it took some individual to stand up and say, hold on a minute, maybe women should have the vote. At the time, that would be considered deviant. Today, it would be considered normative. Same could be said with slavery, and the same could also be said with the legalization of homosexuality. A number of other functionalists follow in the wake of Durkheim in arguing that there may be positive functions of crime and deviance. Kingsley Davis argued that actually prostitution could be seen as a positive thing, that it could be a safety valve for men's sexual frustrations, and that men in engaging in soliciting prostitutes are in fact letting off that frustration rather than perhaps taking it out on their wives or families or other members of the public, and that he would argue that prostitution does not threaten the monogamous nuclear family, that husbands when they're engaging in soliciting prostitutes know that it's a sort of one-off moment and that they won't tell their wives, and so for the most part the monogamous nuclear family will remain whole. Very controversial, many would argue. Ned Polsky argued that pornography in fact is a safe channel for sexual desires, potentially both in men and women, but probably focusing mostly on men once again. And that, again, it does not threaten the monogamous nuclear family in the way that perhaps adultery would. Albert Cohen argued that deviance is a warning signal that something in society is not working properly, and it's a signal to policymakers or politicians that something needs to change, and so perhaps they can focus on that deviance and do something about it. Kai Erikson argued that institutions in society actually exist to ensure crime occurs, and this might in fact include the police, that this ensures that society stays together because it's about that boundary maintenance. So it could be that some institutions, when they realise, oh, we need to have some sort of bad guy, or we need to have some sort of fool guy, we need to have someone that we can focus on society and say they're the problem, might actually provoke crime and deviance in order to remain and retain that boundary. And so this leads us to the question of, can there ever be sanctioned rule breaking within society? And many would argue, such as those previously mentioned, that in fact there can be. So for examples, if you think about music festivals or carnivals or demonstrations and even student raise and give weeks, we often find that in those situations, many of the rules that exist in our society, many of the norms which govern our behaviours are relaxed, and it may well be that the law turns a blind eye to certain criminal or deviant behaviours. So it could be argued that they might exist to give individuals the opportunity to commit low-level crime and deviant behaviour, again, maybe to let off some steam, maybe it's acting as a safety valve. Perhaps what we're seeing here is turning a blind eye to very low-level crime and deviance for the greater good. It's almost as if we need to allow young people, or need to allow deviants to engage in some of these behaviours so they don't engage in the sort of darker, more heavy, more serious crimes. Perhaps also it could be part of easing the transition from childhood to adulthood. As a child, when someone commits a deviant act, or perhaps not necessarily a criminal act, what we generally find, however, is that society turns a blind eye, there's a rap around the knuckles, perhaps a stern word said, but ultimately there's an understanding that children are children, they don't really understand what they're doing. As part of the process of easing that transition to adulthood, where ultimately children are then going to be held responsible as adults for their behaviours, perhaps things like music festivals and carnivals could be part of the process of allowing a little bit of rule breaking to happen to ease that transition. So can there ever be sanctioned rule breaking? Well, perhaps there can. There are, however, a number of strong criticisms of Durkheim and his work. Firstly, he argues that some deviance is good, but too much is bad. Well, exactly how much is too much? How do we work out the magical figure or amount of crime that is perfect? He provides no metric for this, and so that is very difficult to understand and explain away. Whilst he might explain its function, that is to create social solidarity, he does not explain why it exists in the first place. If we all know that crime and deviance is wrong, why would we commit it at all? Surely our sort of morals should kick in and prevent us from doing that. Next, crime is functional for whom? The punishment of a murderer may help society, but it's clearly not functional for the murdered victim. So maybe now we need to think a little bit about the victims of crime and argue, is it really functional for them? Well, probably not. Finally, crime does not always promote solidarity. It can promote fear and cause isolation for some individuals, which would be a wholly negative outcome of crime and deviant behaviour. The next key functionalist sociologist we need to consider and key functionalist theory we need to think about is strain theory and the work of Robert K. Merton. He argued that people engage in deviant behaviour when they are unable to achieve socially approved goals by legitimate means. So from childhood, we're taught that there are certain things that we should seek to achieve. If we can't achieve them in the legitimate law-abiding way, we may engage in crime and deviance. He's adapting Durkheim's idea of anomie or normlessness to explain deviance, firstly through structural factors, that we have what we call an unequal opportunity structure, that there simply are not enough opportunities for everyone in society to achieve society's approved goals via legitimate means. Secondly, there may be cultural factors at play here. There is a strong emphasis, in particular in the West and in particular in the United States, on success goals, on being successful, but weaker emphasis on using legitimate means to achieve them. And so perhaps this is why people might deviate. Therefore, deviance for Merton is a product of a strain between, firstly, the goals that a culture encourages individuals to achieve, and secondly, what the structure of society allows individuals to achieve legitimately. And we are being stretched between these two antipoles, and every now and again we may snap, and as a result that may lead to deviance. Merton pulled upon the concept of the American dream to explain this, and in many ways the American dream is now global, and so it's something that we, even in the UK, buy into to a certain extent. American culture values big money success. Being rich and successful is the aim of the American dream. Americans are expected to pursue the dream by legitimate means, working hard, saving, and so on. Americans believe in meritocracy, that those with talent, those who work hard, will be rewarded based on their merit. But in reality, American society works very differently. What we see in America is widespread disadvantages, discrimination, and poverty, in particular towards the working classes and those from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. Therefore, the goal of money and success and the lack of opportunity via legitimate means to achieve this leads to stress and strain, and therefore potentially deviance. The norms to prevent deviance, ultimately, Merton argues, are not strong enough, and that actually Americans generally believe in success by any means, that is, do whatever you need to do in order to achieve. And this can be summed up in the phrase, to the victor the spoils. Whoever wins gets to make their own rules. Whoever wins gets to rewrite history. And so ultimately they can make themselves appear as if they were not deviant, but were simply successful. Merton then goes to identify a range of different deviant adaptations to the strain that individuals may be under. So individuals' position in the social structure affects the way they respond to strain or anomie. There are 5 different types of adaptation he identifies depending on whether an individual accepts, rejects, replaces approved cultural goals and the legitimate means of achieving them. Firstly, conformity. These are people who accept the goals in society and accept the legitimate way of trying to achieve them. This is getting a job, working hard, doing the best you possibly can, conforming to the norm. The next is innovation. They accept the goals, but perhaps not the way in which they should be achieved, and so these people turn to crime in order to get that big money success. Next, ritualism. These individuals no longer accept the goals, that is to say they no longer feel they are possible to be achieved, but at the same time they still go through the same means of trying to achieve them. So life has become a ritual for them. They simply plod on, trying to achieve, knowing that chances are they probably never will. Next, retreatism. People who reject both the goals and the ways in which to achieve it, and they retreat into themselves away from mainstream society. Individuals such as alcoholics and drug addicts could be examples of those engaging in a retreatist adaptation to strain. Finally, rebellion, people who reject outright the goals and the ways of achieving those goals within society and actually want to completely flip the table of society and create a new society and want to bring about new goals and new ways of achieving them. And this is where you might see your political revolutionaries such as Marxists. In terms of evaluating the work of Merton, well, he shows how normal and deviant behaviour can arise from the same goals. Most crime in America is in fact property crime, so crimes against property such as theft, because material wealth is valued so highly. Also, we find that lower class crime rates are much higher, and this is because they have the least opportunities. There does seem to be some strength to Merton's ideas. However, working class crime is overrepresented in crime figures. We generally find that perhaps there is an absence of focus on middle class crime or white collar crime, and so statistics cannot necessarily be taken at face value. The working classes also experience the most crime, and yet most do not deviate. It's worth remembering that most working class people are not deviants, are not criminals. And actually, who is the victim of most working class crime? It tends to be the working classes themselves. Other evaluation points could include, Marxists would argue that there is an ignorance here of the powers of the ruling class, who enforce laws in a way that criminalise the poor but not the rich. Next, there is an assumption here that all people share the big money success value goal, when in fact money isn't always the driver for everyone. There is an assumption here that all crime is towards these ends. But if we think about violence and vandalism, one does not become richer as a result of violence or vandalism, unless of course it's about gaining status, which we will touch upon in a moment. Whilst it accounts for individual deviance, it does not explain group deviance or deviance within subcultures, and this is going to be the focus of our next key area of study. So we now need to consider subcultural strain theory, and this is taking strain theory to its next level. It seeks to criticise Merton's theories and build upon them at the same time, claiming that deviance is a product of a delinquent or deviant subculture who possess different values to the mainstream culture within society. This leads to the creation of an alternative structure of merit and achievement, that is to say, different ways of gaining merit and achievement or status. And primarily we're going to find that subcultural strain theory is going to be working on or focusing on the middle classes, as this is primarily a working class phenomenon. So this brings us on to the work of Albert Cohen, who is looking at subcultural strain theory, and there's a number of key concepts within this. Firstly, status frustration. He argued that deviance is largely a lower or working class phenomenon, and that the inability of the lower or working classes to achieve mainstream success goals via legitimate methods leads to this deviance. Cohen criticises Merton for the focus on individual deviance rather than group deviance. Also that Merton focuses on crime for a purpose, such as theft and fraud, where one becomes richer as a result of engaging in that behaviour, whilst ignoring assault and vandalism and what might be gained from this. Cohen focused on working class boys primarily, who are frozen out of the middle class education system and the legitimate path to status. So generally speaking, one gains status in Western capitalist society by working hard in school, getting qualifications, gaining the status of being a good student, and ultimately taking those qualifications into the workplace and beginning to earn money. For the working classes, they're often frozen out of this system, often labelled negatively, unable to achieve, and ultimately this may begin them along the path to a deviant or delinquent status and a deviant and delinquent career. These boys suffer status frustration, being forced into a low status. They rebel against the middle class status system, so they engage in criminal or deviant behaviours, and ultimately form or join a delinquent or deviant subculture. Within that deviant or delinquent subculture, you're going to find an alternative status hierarchy, Cohen argues. Delinquent or deviant subcultures are characterized by the inversion of mainstream cultural values and norms. When one inverts something, you turn it upside down or inside out. So if the mainstream cultural values and norms are work hard, do your homework, obey the rules, wear your uniform, turn up on time, in perhaps a inverted set of cultural values and norms in a delinquent or deviant subculture, the individual is going to do things such as don't turn up on time, don't do your work, don't engage in lessons, don't wear the uniform properly. And by doing that, one will gain status in an alternative status hierarchy. This can be summarized in the phrase, what society praises, the subculture condemns, or by extension, what the subculture praises, the society condemns. And so, having failed in the legitimate middle-class opportunity structure, the subculture offers boys, in this example, an alternative status hierarchy to achieve within. Individuals win status or respect from their peers via activities and behaviours that run counter to the mainstream. So by breaking the rules or the norms within mainstream society, one actually gains status in an alternative status hierarchy. And so this is why these working class boys or young men would be performing or behaving in this manner. So the three key ideas here are status frustration, value inversion, and the alternative status hierarchy. Whilst these help to explain non-utilitarian crime and deviance, crimes for no purpose, that is, the only thing one's going to gain out of them is status, there are some problems. There is an assumption that working class boys share the middle class goals or values a priori, that is to say before or originally, that is to say that at some point they had been socialized into the correct mainstream goals, norms and values. But in reality, what if they never learnt these goals, norms and values? In which case they're not really deviating as far as they're concerned, they're acting in a logical, normative manner. Finally, we need to consider the work of Cloward and Olin, who refers to three key subcultures of deviance and delinquency. They agreed that working class youths are frozen out of the big money success, legitimate opportunity structure. Not everyone, however, they argued, innovates and engages in utilitarian crimes or non-utilitarian crimes, as the case may be. Some have unequal access actually to the illegitimate opportunity structure. So not everyone who fails legitimately succeeds illegitimately. What does this mean? Well, just because you've struggled and failed to actually do well in the normal mainstream way, that is working hard, getting the grades, getting the job and so on, does not necessarily mean you're going to be successful in going into the more illegitimate or illegal, deviant or criminal world. You're not going to suddenly perhaps become a gang leader, gain loads of status and become rich that way. It could well be that you are a failure in both respects. The three subcultures that I identify is firstly the criminal, and this is where youths gain almost an apprenticeship in crime, such as within the mafia. So it could well be that a person falls out of school or struggles in school, joins one of these deviant or delinquent subcultures and learns the ropes. They learn from perhaps older members of the group or more experienced members of the group how to commit certain crimes, and they slowly work their way up. Next, the conflict subculture. You tend to find these in areas where there is a high population churn, lots of people moving in, moving out. So rather than having tight-knit gangs or groups with strict hierarchies, instead you're going to have very loose affiliations of individuals who are primarily fighting for territory and often fighting amongst themselves rather than perhaps engaging in utilitarian crime. And you find this occurring in places such as East London and other major cities all over the world. Finally, the retreatist subculture. These are people who have failed in both the legitimate and illegitimate opportunity structure. They tend to retreat into themselves, very similar here to what we looked at before with Merton. And this could be individuals such as drug abusers or alcoholics. In terms of criticisms of Cloward and Olin, there's a range once again. Firstly, they agree with Merton and Cohen that most crime is working class, thus ignoring the crimes of the wealthy, which would be a concern for Marxists. Their theory is arguably too deterministic and over-predicts the extent of working class crime. They ignore the wider power structure, including who makes and enforces the law. So perhaps we need to consider who's actually deciding what the laws are, probably the bourgeoisie, Marxists would argue, or perhaps men or feminists would argue, and who enforces it. Once again, perhaps for Marxists and feminists that have something to say about that. They draw the boundaries arguably too sharply between the different types, as if it would not be possible to belong to more than one of these subcultures simultaneously. So it could well be that someone is a dropout but engages in perhaps some criminal type behaviour. They assume that everyone starts off sharing the same mainstream success goals, the same problems that other functionalists have fallen into there. And Maxwell claims that most delinquents are not strongly committed to their subculture, as string theory suggests, but merely drift in and out of delinquency. So it may not be as hard and fast as it first seems. That's it. Thank you very much.